What is the most popular card in Clash Royale? The Mega Knight? One of the champions? Perhaps it's everyone's favorite Evolved Royal Giant? Although all of these are popular, none of them have even come close to maintaining the consistent popularity held by the Log. A mere 2 elixir card whose sole function is to roll across the ground, killing or knocking back any ground troop that lies within its path. From an outsider perspective, the Log at first glance may not seem like a very interesting or particularly amazing card, but this card has been a staple in the Clash Royale meta for several years and continues to be by far the most popular card in ladder and grand challenges by over double digits. No card even comes close to the popularity of the Log despite multiple nerfs and similar cards being added over the years in an attempt to provide more competition. For many cards, rates like this would typically result in an emergency nerf, but the Log has held rates similar to this for years, hardly ever getting attention, and it doesn't seem like it'll be going anywhere anytime soon. So I want to dive deep into the Log's history today. Talk about what the purpose of this card was, its influence on the game over the years, its ups and downs, and why Supercell is hesitant to give the card a proper nerf. The Log was one of the 4 new cards added in the July 2016 update. It was a pretty big deal because the card was 2 elixir and a spell, which meant that it was clearly meant to compete with the Zap spell. The Zap spell was easily one of the most dominant and versatile spells at the time of the Log's release. Many believed the Zap spell wasn't overpowered though, instead rather just lacking proper competition. Poison and Fireball competed with each other as 4 elixir spells, and Lightning and Rocket competed as well, but up to this point, Zap just really didn't have a competitor. The advantage of using the Log was that it knocked back troops instead of stunning them and dealt more damage, meaning it could completely kill the princess for a positive elixir trade. This was huge because the princess was an absurdly overpowered card throughout 2016, and its previous main counter was arrows, but that wasn't a positive elixir trade. Here's what the problem was though. The interaction against the princess specifically was the only real reason you would ever consider using a Log instead of a Zap. The Zap could completely reset Inferno Towers and Sparkies, as well as being placed anywhere in the arena. The Log was very unique in this aspect, as it was the only spell in Clash Royale that could not be placed anywhere in the arena. This meant if the opponent just tucked a princess in the back of the arena, a Log wasn't going to do any good until that princess walked in front of the princess tower. The Log could be cycled onto the tower for some chip damage, but you had to place the Log at the furthest tile up that you could in order to do so. You may be thinking, the Log is a legendary card, meaning there must be something special about it unlike the Zap, which was a mere common. But there really was nothing too special about the Log. It's not like knocking back troops was a special legendary ability. So how did the Log perform upon release, you may wonder? Grand challenges didn't exist yet, so looking at top ladder statistics from July 2016, the Log was in 0% of top ladder decks. Now granted, legendaries were extremely difficult to level up at the time. You would need thousands of dollars to max out a legendary within a few weeks, but I still think this statistic is an accurate reflection of the card's power at the time. It was considered to be a really weak card. There were several reasons why the Log was underperforming. It just had no purpose. It's pretty clear this card was intended to be an alternative choice to Zap. For context, Zap in 2016 was far stronger than the Zap we have today, being able to kill goblins at equal level and stunning troops for a full second rather than half a second like today. So even though the Goblin Barrel did exist in 2016, Log didn't have the advantage of being the only spell to fully counter it for a positive elixir trade. The Log was just completely outclassed by the Zap in almost every way. And the biggest advantage the Zap had over the Log was speed. A lot of Zap's power was the fact that it would very quickly do its job after placing it. It didn't need time to fly like the other spells, and the Log was extremely slow, moving at a speed of only 140 tiles per minute. For frame of reference, a Hog Rider runs at 120 tiles per minute, which may sound fast since the Hog Rider does travel at the maximum speed a troop can go, but for spells, 140 tiles per minute is incredibly slow. Just as an example, the modern day arrows travel at 1100 tiles per minute, and even the second slowest projectile spell, the Rocket, traveled at a speed of 350 tiles per minute. Imagine your opponent uses a skeleton army to counter your Hog Rider and you have a Log. Unless you pre-placed your Log, that skeleton army was going to wipe out your Hog before the Log collided with them. This is why the Zap being instant was so advantageous. Why pick a spell that basically does the exact same thing as Zap but can't hit air and basically only kills the same cards as Zap? Zap was completely dominating the game and Log was certainly no competitor to this card. In fact, in August 2016, the Zap had its strongest season yet, appearing in a whopping 98% of the top 100 ladder decks with the Log still not making a single appearance. Zap was a necessity to have in every deck, and it's not even like the Princess was out of the meta either. As I said, Log killing Princess was basically the one advantage it had, but even with the Princess at a 50% use rate in top ladder, Log garnered absolutely no interest to try to counter this. It was obvious that Zap either needed a big nerf or Log needed a big buff, so when the balance changes came later in August, Supercell would actually do both in hopes to persuade some people to switch their Zap for a Log. The Zap's stun time would be reduced from 1 second to half a second, and the Log's casting speed would be increased from 180 tiles per minute to 300, along with its movement speed being increased from 140 tiles per minute to 170. Its slow speed was probably its least appealing feature, so buffing that was a good place to start. With the Zap significantly weaker than before, it made a bit more room for the Log to wiggle into the meta. Although the Zap's use rate fell significantly in top ladder after this nerf, the Log's use rate barely increased at all. Zap was still by far the best spell, and it's understandable why. But wait a minute. Why didn't the Log have any sort of special ability like Princess or Ice Wizard? It knocked things back, sure, but Fireball and Rocket could knock things back too, and those cards were only rare rarity. The month after this first buff, Supercell would give the Log another buff, this time giving it a very unique ability, which would make it deserving of its legendary status. On September 19th, 2016, the Log was given the ability to knock back any ground troop. This meant it could knock back the heaviest troops like P.E.K.K.A. and Golem, previously troops that were impossible to knock back. It could even push back the miner while he was still underground. This unique ability really helped match the incredibly versatile stun ability. By the end of September, Log amassed to a 4% use rate, still 61% behind its blue foe. There clearly still needed to be some more work done to find the perfect balance. Right now though, Log was a very niche card. It was a solid card by itself, but logging golems was just a very rare situation. Throughout October, the Log's use rate continued to climb, now at 8%, but still pretty low compared to the Zap's 66%. Log didn't really have any specific niche decks where it explicitly worked better than Zap. It was mainly just occasionally replacing Zap in already popular Zap decks. 8% usage is actually alright for most cards, but Supercell historically likes to keep spells, especially less annoying spells, at a significantly higher use rate than most cards. It's less about what's statistically overpowered and what the community perceives to be overpowered. Even though the Zap had close to a 70% usage rate in top ladder, people weren't having less fun or calling for nerfs to the Zap because it was everywhere. It felt fine, the competition was just lacking. Zap was an important tool that was necessary for most players to have to keep potentially overpowered cards in check. Therefore, for the third month in a row, Log would be buffed. This time, Supercell was giving the Log 4 distinct stat buffs. On October 20th, 2016, no Zap nerf would come, but a massive Log buff was here. Its casting speed was increased by an additional 60 tiles per minute or 1 per second, and its projectile speed was also increased by 30 tiles per minute. Thirdly, its damage would be increased by 8.5%, which didn't have any major interaction changes. And lastly, perhaps the biggest buff of all, its range would be increased from 9.6 tiles to 11.6 tiles. Before this change, you had to play your Log right at the bridge in order for it to touch the tower, but now you could play it a full 2 tiles away from the bridge and still have it chip the Princess Tower, which added some nice extra versatility. You could also now counter a Goblin Barrel with the Log and it would roll far enough to kill a princess at the bridge. Supercell clearly wanted the Log to be good. This is an enormous buff. In the following days of this buff, Log would rise from an 8% use rate to a 68% use rate, shattering the Zap's place and becoming the most popular card in competitive play. The top 4 most popular decks at the time were all running Log now. Giant Bowler was the most popular deck at the time, where lots of people were playing it with Zap, but a significant number of people were subbing the Zap with the Log now. Expo was the second most popular deck, which succeeded with the newly buffed Log, and you wouldn't see Zap with Expo anymore. Log had fully replaced it in this archetype. Log was certainly at a peak, but Zap wasn't going down without a fight. After a hard drop, the Zap's use rate was actually steadily rising back up. By November, it was back up to a 57% use rate, becoming the third most popular card in top ladder, right under the Log, which was the second most used card in the game at the time, which had risen to an astonishing 79% use rate. Zap and Log were not really competing with each other anymore. Both cards were so powerful and served their purposes so well that a lot of people simply started using them together. The most popular deck in the game was a Golem deck that contained both Zap and the Log, and multiple other decks on the top deck list were running both 2 elixir spells as well. The Zap's main role was still taking out swarms, mainly goblins and skeletons, and Log was primarily used for its insane knockback and cycling damage on the King's Tower, with just the added bonus of taking out swarms if Zap wasn't available. Even a level 1 Log would deal 104 damage to the Princess Tower, and it being 2 elixir made it really easy to cycle even when there weren't many troops down. The knockback was insane, knocking back any card it hit a full 1.5 tiles back. If placed right, could even be used against the miner to activate your king tower. This version of the log not only did more than double the knockback compared to today's log, but also dealt more than double the damage to king towers and had more range. Yet despite all of this, despite thriving in its own right and having amazing stats for a 2 elixir spell, the Zap still fulfilled its niche of taking care of swarms much better. So the Zap would make a huge comeback in December, overtaking the log in usage, becoming the #1 card in the game again. One major factor in this massive sudden change was due to the rise of elite barbarians, which had gotten a massive buff in December. Elite barbarians were fast, and Zap was a much better card to accompany the tempo of this troublesome duo because of its instantaneous nature. Princess was also much less popular than it used to be, meaning log didn't really have anything in the arena that it could counter better than Zap. However, towards the end of the year, YouTuber Molt would popularize a spell bait deck that would contain the log as its main small spell, and log worked well in this deck because the way you would play this deck is basically chipping away at your opponent's tower throughout the game, of which log was much better at than the Zap. On top of that, you didn't really need to be prepared for Inferno Tower or Inferno Dragon since the deck was comprised of mostly swarms. With so much log and Zap going around, spellbait was starting to become pretty popular as counterplay to this. The benefits of Zap didn't really matter in this archetype, so you would exclusively see log instead of Zap in spellbait. The rate stayed about the same going into January, and competitively you would continue to see log almost exclusively in Expo and spellbait. Log's primary use wasn't eliminating swarms, it was mainly just a cheap way to chip the tower or keep things away from your Expo. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but because of this, it just meant Zap was in the exact position it was in before log received any buffs, which defeated almost the entire purpose of adding the log in the first place. One way Supercell tried to give the log purpose was by adding another card that log could kill for a positive elixir trade, but not the Zap. This was the Dark Goblin, added on January 13th, 2017. But adding a new card to give the log a little more purpose wasn't going to diminish the Zap's purpose. The Dark Goblin wasn't even good when it was first released anyway. Buffing the log at this point seemed like a bad idea though. It may have had way less usage than Zap, but 31% was still pretty high. Towards the end of January, we would get some very important balance changes that would change the direction of Zap and log forever. Both Zap and the log would appear in the balance changes in January 2017. Since even when the log was really strong, the Zap still thrived, it made sense to just bite the bullet and nerf the Zap again. So that's what they would do, but the log wouldn't get away scot-free, as in the same balance change its pushback range would be reduced from 1.5 tiles to 1 tile, as well as a damage nerf of 4%. The Zap would get a damage nerf of 6%. Although it appears log got the harsher nerf here, it would be the exact opposite. A damage nerf of 4% to the log didn't change any interactions, but a damage nerf of 6% was devastating for the Zap. The biggest interaction change was that it couldn't kill goblins anymore. Now the log had the advantage of being the only 2 elixir spell to completely counter goblin barrels. So despite the log's nerf, it exploded to being the #1 most used card in the game once again. After the Zap's nerf, goblin barrel was on the rise, so people needed the log now. Zap certainly wasn't dead though, as it was still being used in nearly half of all top ladder decks. And in the beginning of February, Zap and log were actually still the 2 most used cards in the game. Spellbait and Expo were still both very popular with the log, and the now iconic Hog Rider deck that had been around for several months at this point had replaced the Zap with the log and is still one of the most popular decks in the game to this very day. Being able to wipe out the goblin troop was very important, and Zap just couldn't handle it anymore, and the log's purpose would only become greater as time went on. On February 24th, 2017, another new card would come out which would have a massive impact on the log and Zap's place in the meta. This was the Goblin Gang. The Zap could still take out the spear goblins, but not the regular goblins. So for example, if they used a Goblin Gang to counter your Hog Rider, the Zap wasn't going to help you as much against it. Therefore, even more demand for log was created. Soon after the Goblin Gang came out, another iconic deck would be created involving the log. This wasn't spellbait, this was log bait. Previous forms of spellbait were meant to bait not just the log, but Zap and arrows too, but this form of spellbait was specifically tailored to beating log users. It included Goblin Gang, Goblin Barrel, Princess, and Ice Spirit, all cards that would not die to Zap. Log bait quickly grew in popularity and became massively more mainstream meta than any previous spellbait deck ever was. And the reason this archetype was able to thrive so much is because log was everywhere. You saw log in Golem, Hog Rider, Giant, Three Musketeers, Expo, Logbait, Royal Giant, and Miner. It was probably the most versatile spell in Clash Royale history, besides the Zap a year earlier. It was clear that the Zap nerf gave the Log too much of an advantage, so on March 13th, 2017, Supercell would nerf the Log again. They would nerf the damage by another 4%, meaning it now did the same damage as it did upon release. They also reduced the range from 11.6 tiles to 11.1 tiles, meaning you couldn't play the Log 2 tiles away from the bridge and still have it reach the Princess Tower anymore. However, there would be a third secret nerf that was completely accidental that would also come with these other two changes. This was that the Log could no longer be played on top of buildings. This may sound inconsequential, but this really hurt the Log in two major situations. For one, it made it much worse in siege decks. Since you're typically using your Log to protect your siege building, it was common to play your Log right on top of it, so not being able to do that anymore was really frustrating. It was also bad if you were trying to protect your elixir pump from a goblin barrel. As I said, this was unintended, so on the same day as these nerfs went live, Supercell had an emergency maintenance break buffing the Log's range back to 11.6 tiles. This is the shortest time in Clash Royale history a card has gone without being changed. It was only about 8 hours from the time of the changes going live to the emergency maintenance break, so it's impossible to even tell how the Log was performing for that short period of time. But it now meant the Log could reach the Princess Tower even when played 2 tiles from the bridge once again. And the reason they re-increased the range instead of just fixing the building glitch is because it was actually part of a client update that couldn't be fixed with just a maintenance break. Supercell said they were going to be holding off the range nerf until they could fix the building issue, and the changes would be implemented in the next update. After all these changes, it hardly made a dent in the Log's performance. It was still appearing in over half of the top ladder decks. The building glitch with Log did cause Expo to have a hard drop though. Logbait seemed to only be getting stronger, and you still found the Log being played in a multitude of archetypes. Log and Zap were actually both pretty even in terms of usage. Finally, in the June 2017 update, Supercell would fix the Log so now it could be played on buildings again, and the range reduction would finally come into play. There was actually also supposed to be a change where when the Log killed the battle ram, it would no longer hit the barbarians that spawned from it. But this was removed at the last second, and to this day, you can still double dip on the Log's damage if you use it to knock out a battle ram. Regardless, the range nerf practically made no difference, as by July, Log was still the #1 card in top ladder. This would change in August though, because the bats would be buffed to have a 5 count instead of 4. Bats were unique in this situation because they were the only troop that died to the Zap, but not the Log at equal level, and thus Zap quickly reclaimed its spot as the #1 spell during this bat-filled meta. Log wouldn't become the #1 spell in top ladder until November again, as the Goblin Gang took over the bats in terms of popularity. Both spells were still doing incredibly well, but the Log was still easily considered to be the best card in the game. Despite its consistent popularity, Supercell wasn't nerfing it anymore. It didn't seem like it would make the game healthier to nerf the Log. As I said earlier, spells just tend to have higher use rates because it wasn't so much that they were overpowered, but there were less of them and they were just necessary tools to deal with a variety of troops in the meta. As we've seen, they did commonly fluctuate depending on what troops were thriving the most. However, the Log would receive one more balance change before the year was over. But this was a change that was applied to all direct damage spells. This was likely mostly due to the rocket, which had a surging prominence towards the end of 2017. But even disregarding that, so many popular decks at this point just relied on cycling spells on the Princess Tower. It was a really overpowered strategy, and it was a boring way to play because there wasn't any way to kill spells. All spells did 40% of their original damage to crown towers, but in December would be reduced to 35%. This was a good change because it didn't affect any interactions against troops, but made spell cycling less effective. Rocket cycling was simply too strong, and the other spells were powerful enough without the added ability to whittle down crown towers so fast. It was certainly one of the things Log was used for, especially in the more popular Log decks such as Expo, Logbait, and Hog 2.6. It was a fairly minor nerf though, so Log continued to do fine after this change. Although in December, Inferno Dragon, Inferno Tower, and Bats were all really popular, so Zap took the throne for this season. This back and forth would continue in the coming months. One thing was explicitly clear though, Zap and Log were both overused. Nerfs weren't going to fix the main issue here though. They needed more competition. In April 2018, Supercell would add a new card that would give the Log specifically some much needed competition. This card was Barbarian Barrel. This card acted very similarly to the Log, rolling on the ground, dealing the same damage as Log to anything in its path. It could also knock some troops back, but didn't have the special ability to knock back any card like the Log did. The main appeal of the Barbarian Barrel was the fact that a Barbarian would spawn from it. However, there were some pretty major drawbacks, the biggest one being that the Barbarian Barrel was 3 elixir. Being 1 more elixir than the Log made it incredibly less versatile by comparison, and the Barbarian did not make up for that extra cost. Secondly, its range was much shorter, meaning it could not get guaranteed chip damage. If ignored, the Barbarian from the barrel would get 3 hits on the tower, so it may just seem like a risk-reward situation, where the damage isn't guaranteed, but if you do get the connection, it's much more. But countering a single Barbarian for 3 elixir was incredibly easy. The last major drawback was, like the Log upon its release, incredibly slow. The Barbarian Barrel historically is probably the worst a card has ever been upon release, having both the lowest use and win rate in the game. And that was saying something considering the heal spell existed. Obviously though, Supercell is going to buff a newly added underpowered card, and with its role being so similar to the Log, wasn't going to seem like a joke forever. And a few months later, Supercell added another 2 elixir spell, the Giant Snowball, which seemed like a direct competitor more so to the Zap than the Log, but nevertheless would eventually add some proper competition to the Log and the Zap's reign. However, like the Barbarian Barrel, the Giant Snowball upon release was an awful card. It seemed like a ritual at this point. All 4 of these cards were abysmally bad upon their releases. The Barbarian Barrel was given numerous buffs for the preceding months after its release, but it seemed like no matter what they did, it just wasn't finding a proper place. Supercell eventually realized that no matter how good they made the card, it just wasn't going to be able to compete with the Log in a healthy, meaningful way at 3 elixir. Log was way better at getting positive elixir trades against many of the cards found in Log bait. A single Barbarian that hardly ever got value was not better than saving 1 whole elixir. So in September 2018, Supercell would reduce the Barbarian Barrel's elixir cost to 2, now matching the Log. Although the Knockback was removed as a result of this, it had gotten numerous previous buffs that gave the barrel numerous advantages over the Log. Not only could you get a positive elixir trade on the Goblin Barrel now and get a bonus Barbarian, but the damage had been increased so much that it could kill archers for a positive elixir trade, something even the Log was unable to do. Yet, even despite all the advantages it seemed like the Barbarian Barrel had, it was still completely overshadowed by the Log. The biggest issue was just the speed of it. It was really slow. So in October, Supercell would give the Barbarian Barrel yet another buff. This was the 5th buff it had received in 6 months. Its casting and projectile speed would both be increased by 50 tiles per minute, which meant the card now had the same casting speed and projectile speed as the Log. On top of that, the Barbarian's load-in time would go from half a second to 0.2 seconds. The card could now keep up with the fast tempo of Clash Royale matches, which really helped it out a lot. And I mean, it really helped. The Log was still popular after the buff, but the Barbarian Barrel finally started providing serious competition to the Log's throne. The main reason Log was still getting a lot of play was mainly due to its ability to chip the Princess Towers, which was very important. But the number of other advantages Barbarian Barrel provided at this point could not be ignored, and thus the Log's use rate did begin to trickle down. Barbarian Barrel seemed to be doing its job well now, providing another small spell option without making the already existing ones irrelevant. It had been the norm for years at this point that every meta deck had either a Zap or a Log, but with Barbarian Barrel being meta, this was no longer the case. Although Log was still doing alright, Barbarian Barrel's use rate was climbing quickly. Its use rate eventually surpassed the Log's, and by November had a 47% use rate with a 65% win rate. This caused the Log's use rate to fall substantially, leaving it at a 17% use rate with a 51% win rate. The barrel was boxing out the Log so much and now had more usage than Zap and Log combined. Log was still the primary choice for a small spell in Logbait and Expo, but almost every other archetype such as Miner, Graveyard, and Royal Giant were all starting to sub out their Log for the Barbarian Barrel. This was easily the worst position Log has been in for years, which is saying something because a 17% use rate is still above average. In December, Barbarian Barrel would get a damage nerf of 4%, which meant it could no longer kill archers, and the Barbarian would start moving 1/20th of a second later now. But regardless, the card was still very powerful, and this nerf actually did very little to fix the balance. By the start of January, Barbarian Barrel's use rate was even higher than before, now at 55%. It would get another nerf in January 2019 as a result, but it made virtually zero difference as the use and win rates were literally exactly the same. Meanwhile, Log was hovering around a 20% use rate, much lower than its typical rate before the Barbarian Barrel was meta. Even with further nerfs, Barb Barrel wasn't budging from its #1 spot, and Log was suffering as a consequence in the meantime. Supercell was having a lot of trouble balancing the Barbarian Barrel. By July, although the Log kept its moderately high use rate, its win rate had fallen to a mere 41%, which is a below average win rate. Usually if a popular card's win rate becomes this low, it doesn't remain popular, but the Log was a card a lot of players would not let go of. which is why I think the use rate is not the best metric of strength in situations like this. This slight drop in use and win rate can be at least partly attributed to the giant snowball, which had been steadily rising in popularity and was by now the dominant 2 elixir spell despite a nerf in July. It wouldn't be until August 2019 until the barb barrel got a proper nerf that would finally make some more room for the log to thrive once again. It was the 6th nerf the card had received in a 9-month period, and it was detrimental to the card, nerfing its damage so much that it no longer killed princesses, dark goblins, or rascal girls. It couldn't even take out an ice spirit. The log was now the only 2 elixir spell that could do enough damage to kill these cards again, giving it an important advantage. It could still kill goblins though, meaning it was in a solid middle ground area between Zap and Log. Log's use rate swiftly rose to 30%, while the Barbarian Barrel had a drastic fall. However, the giant snowball was still very popular around this time, and thus actually had the log beat in terms of usage. By September, things evened out, as Zap, Log, and Snowball all had identical rates. In the following month, the giant snowball would receive a nerf, and this resulted in a correlative rise in usage for the log. Log was now in nearly 40% of Grand Challenge decks, proving to be just as powerful as it once was, with the Barbarian Barrel also seeing a small rise in popularity, likely due to the crazy witch meta that rose about the same month. Despite the rise, the barrel would get a buff the following season, and although the use rate rose because of it, Log was still peaking at 40%. It was pretty crazy how bad Supercell was at finding the perfect balance between the Log and Barb barrel. In a span of just 19 months, it got 12 balance changes, and in that same time frame, the Log got 0 balance changes. But after so much tweaking and reworking and buffing and nerfing, the balance was the best it's ever been. By January 2020, the 2 cards had the exact same usage. Supercell had finally done it. Obviously, it didn't remain exactly the same forever. There would be fluctuations throughout 2020 between the 2 cards depending on the meta. But by the summertime, the log was keeping its #1 spot in the game pretty consistently, where the use rate was peaking as high as 30%. So finally in August, the log would get some nerfs to tone it down a bit. At this point, it had been over 2 years since its last change, of which was the Crown Tower reduction nerf back in December 2017. Now, with the Barbarian Barrel not distracting the balancing team, Supercell decided the log was still too powerful, so it would get its Crown Tower damage reduced from 35% of its total damage to 30%. This was applied to all direct damage spells, so this in itself could not have indicated that Supercell was giving direct attention to the log. But keep in mind that the Barbarian Barrel is not a direct damage spell, so it was unaffected by this change. However, the log would also get a range reduction from 11.1 tiles to 10.1 tiles, meaning you now had to play the log right at the bridge in order for it to reach the Princess Tower. This also meant it could no longer kill a troop standing right in front of a Princess Tower from the bridge, nor could it kill a center-placed Goblin Barrel and a Princess standing at the bridge. Well, technically you still could, but you had to have perfect timing and placement now. The log was hit hard in this balance change. It may have seemed well-deserved, since it was the best card in the game stat-wise, but players were furious at this change. People were saying Supercell was ruining the game because of it, or that the log should have been an epic now. This change was so memed on and hated, I was honestly surprised. But the log is one of the least hated cards in the game, so people typically didn't call for nerfs despite its popularity. August 2020 was probably one of the most controversial set of balance changes in the game's history, in big part thanks to the log nerf. Drew, the community manager, even acknowledged how hated and controversial these balance changes were. But do keep in mind that the community was already in a pretty negative mood for the entirety of 2020 due to the lack of updates. Drew came out and gave his explanation to the log nerf, explaining that the point of the range nerf was to increase the skill cap. Now, I know it's easy to look back retrospectively and think how crazy people were for overreacting to this, but even at the time, I don't think this nerf was as bad as people were making it out to be. Although it did have an initial fall, the card was right back up to a 33% use rate in a few weeks, practically identical if not higher than it was before. Log was still the third most popular card in the game, and this nerf was obviously not the killer many players expected it to be at the time. It was just going to be a matter of what troops were thriving in the meta to determine these spells' places in the game for the future. By February 2021, Log was back to being the #1 most popular card in the game with a use rate of 35%. And even though it didn't hold this spot long, it was a testament to show that this was still an incredibly powerful card. However, throughout the entirety of 2021, both Log and Barbarian Barrel would not receive any changes, and their place in the meta would not change much. Obviously, the top meta decks are changing every few months, but because the log was so popular, I don't feel the need to go over every single meta deck that contains the log. I've already gone over the main archetypes it was viable in, and its purpose was pretty clear and cut no matter which deck it was in. Even though Expo was a dying archetype by this point, and Logbait was not a competitively viable deck in summer 2021, Log was easily able to adapt and still appeared in more than a quarter of all decks. By the end of the year, that number had risen to being in nearly 40% of Grand Challenge decks once again. Although for most of the year the Barbarian barrels and Log's use rate were practically neck and neck, by the end of the year the Log had pulled ahead once again by a double-digit lead. As the meta was evolving into 2022, the Log and Barb barrel's use rate was only drifting further apart. By June, the Log peaked at a 46% use rate, with the Barb barrels down to just 18% now. This was actually mainly due to the Skeleton King and the decks surrounding him becoming so popular. The Log worked much better against these decks than the other small spells. People began to take notice of how absurd the Log's rates actually were, and a lot of discussion around it began to brew. The Log had nearly double the usage rate of the second most popular card in the game, and this got players talking about whether or not the Log needed a nerf. Yet it seemed like Supercell had already decided on nerfing the Log, because on May 21st, 2022, they would announce that Log would be getting a nerf in June. The plan was to reduce its knockback from 1 tile to half a tile. Here's a side-by-side comparison. It was a massive change, and as history shows us, players did not like their precious wood being touched. Multiple posts were going viral in the community disapproving of the Log nerf. Pro players were also denouncing this change. Polls were done overwhelmingly displaying the player base's disapproval, and overall Supercell was getting a lot of flack for this one change. I personally strongly agreed with the nerf at the time, and many other players seemed to feel the same way, although being in the minority opinion for sure. This one comment I found wrapped up my thoughts pretty well. Last time they nerfed Log, people were crying, saying Log would become useless, and here we are back at square one with Log being used in half of all decks, and players crying once again when their card is about to get nerfed. I know it may seem crazy in the first place to some people who aren't as familiar with the Clash Royale landscape that players could say a card, despite having by a landslide the highest usage rate in the game while already having substantially good competition, didn't need a nerf. But plenty of people defended the notion that Log did not need a nerf for several reasons. One common reason was that if the Log didn't keep decks like Skeleton King Swarm and Goblin Barrel in check, those decks would become way too strong and that meta would be a much less fun meta to play in. So if you just nerfed those decks, the Log wouldn't be as popular because the Log's popularity was a reaction to the popularity of other decks. But I have to partly disagree with this. There are plenty of ways Supercell could nerf the Log while keeping its effectiveness against those decks the same. And it's not like the Log's rates were only like this for a month or two as a reaction to a surging new meta deck. The use rates had been well over 30%, if not 40%, for 8 months by this point. A typical healthy average card at the time should have had a 6 to 9% use rate. The other excuse that was much more common was that the other small spells didn't provide proper competition to the Log, so buffing these spells would be a better route to go because more people would use them, naturally causing the Log's use rate to fall. But I just think this is a really weak argument considering the stats of the other small spells. Let's check the stats of all 4 small spells just 2 days before this nerf was supposed to go live. Log had a 46% use rate, Barbarian Barrels was 18%, Zaps was 14%, and Snowballs was 5%. Keep in mind, the Log had the lowest win rate of the 4 as well. Barbarian Barrel and Zap had above average use rates despite the Log's popularity. Why would cards with above average and healthy rates need a buff? The point of buffing a card is because it was being underused, and that was objectively not true with these spells. And yes, while the Snowball was a little low, 5% is still not that bad. People argued small spells needed a buff to knock Log from its throne, but why not just nerf the other spells to allow Snowball's use rate to naturally rise? It can work both ways, and considering the rates were already on the higher end for the other 3 small spells, nerfing the Log seems like the most reasonable thing to do when trying to balance out the stats. The Log defenders were very passionate, and it was annoying some players to the point where mock posts were made to laugh at them. But with so much backlash, Supercell actually caved and cancelled the nerf. The community's influence changed the history of the Log forever. However, it wouldn't be getting away scot-free here. It would get a different nerf instead. The Crown Tower damage would go from 30% of its total damage to 20%. This meant it practically did the same damage to Crown Towers as the Zap and Snowball, drastically hindering the effectiveness of cycling it for chip damage. Although I was fine with the knockback reduction change, I really do like this nerf as well because I think spell cycling is the least fun strategy in the entire game to play against because there's nothing you can do about it. This was very interesting at the same time though because before this nerf, the percentage of damage dealt to Crown Towers was kept consistent among all spells, even even when those spells really didn't deserve the nerf. So I'm curious as to why they decided to break the consistency now and not in the past. Overall though, I think it's okay to break consistency patterns for the sake of creating a more balanced meta. This nerf practically had no effect on the log's usage rate though. A few months after the nerf, the card was still thriving with a use rate of over 40%, easily towering over the second most popular card by over double digits. In the grand scheme of the log's power, the chip damage was not what made it super strong, so this made sense. A big reason was also due to the massive rise in log bait, since the Goblin Gang would receive a third Spear Goblin and become very strong again in October 2022. But little did the community know that this was going to be changing very quickly, very soon. Although in October the log's use rate was still at an astonishing 46%, only days after this statistic was taken would log have the worst fall it's had since the Barbarian Barrel's peak. But this wasn't because of any balance changes. This was due to two new cards that would be added in the new update, the Monk and the Phoenix. The Phoenix is considered to be the most overpowered card in Clash Royale history to many players, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. This card was absolutely broken upon its release, and in only a couple days rose to having an 81% use rate in Grand Challenges. As a result, the meta was completely warped overnight, and unlike every preceding meta, the log was not able to adapt well to the environment, which was very strange considering how well the log seemed to adapt in any environment previously. But it does make sense. Why would you need a ground spell in a Flying Phoenix Mirror Rage spam meta? Not to even mention the Monk, which was also very strong, could reflect spells with its special ability. As a result, the log's use rate fell by nearly 30% in a couple of days, now sitting at a 17% use rate with a terrible win rate. Even the Barbarian Barrel was doing better now. For the first time since 2016, log was actually a weak card. This was only because of the very unique environment that required players to be prepared to deal with Phoenixes specifically, and log was not ready for that. Obviously, when a card is this good, it's going to get nerfed very quick. So this dip was very short. Although the Phoenix and Monk did get emergency nerfed on November 2nd, a nerf that would indirectly buff the log would come on November 21st, where the Phoenix's egg would lose 34% of its hit points, now allowing a log to fully take it out, preventing the second Phoenix from spawning in. This was a huge interaction change that definitely made the log worth playing in this Phoenix-filled environment. The Barbarian Barrel could also fully take it out now, so this wasn't just an extra advantage that was exclusive to log. But the Phoenix is a card historically that has always been meta since it's been released, even to this very day. So having one of these two cards became even more important. Back in no time, the log's use rate was back up to 47%, but it wasn't the number one card, as the Phoenix was now ahead of it by far. Goblins and Goblin Gang were way more popular thanks to the buffs, only making the demand for log higher. After further Phoenix and Monk nerfs, log did reclaim its number one spot and was again by far the most popular card in the game. It's clear Supercell wasn't harsh enough with the Crown Tower reduction nerf back in June, so in February 2023, Supercell would nerf the log one more time. It seems like they really wanted to avoid community backlash because they went about this in a much more interesting way. In some of the more recent balance changes, Supercell has been doing work-in-progress balance changes, where they put out proposed balance changes and tweak them based on community feedback. In the work-in-progress balance changes for February, there was no log listed anywhere on the list, but when they released the final list, the log gets snuck on there at the last second. This is something they hadn't done up to this point, and I gotta say, I personally found it pretty funny because it was just so random and unexpected, and it was pretty obvious they were scared of backlash. Supercell was going to do what they tried to do 8 months prior, nerfing the knockback range of the log. This nerf would reduce the log's pushback range from 1 tile to 0.7 tiles. It seems they didn't want to commit to making it half a tile like the original plan was, but at least this was something. This balance change got nowhere near the amount of backlash as the one in June 2022 or August 2020. Surprisingly, a good chunk of players seemed generally okay with it. The player base had gone through the cycle of overreacting to small nerfs to this card so many times that it was pretty obvious that the card was going to be fine after this nerf. And it was. Weeks after this nerf, the card was still number one in the game. And that nerf was the last nerf the log would ever receive up to the modern day of Clash Royale, and even today still remains as the most popular card in the game by double digits. The log can truly never die. So what is the future for log? There's so many possibilities, and I want to discuss a few potential ideas. I don't think the log should be left alone because it's clearly still very strong statistically, and I want to clear up a potential misconception. I don't hate the log and I do want it to be viable. I just sound negative talking about it because I just don't think any card should have the rates the log has for this long, and I wish Supercell would stop being so afraid to give it a proper nerf. I'm not even expecting the log to have an average 6 to 10% use rate like a standard troop. I would be okay with the log's usage rate being around 20%, nearly half of what it is now, and this would match the barbarian barrel's current use rate. So I would continue to do what Supercell has been doing and give the log small nerfs. There's a few potential ideas I would like to see. One is nerfing the knockback to half a tile like they planned back in 2022. They could possibly even give it an interesting rework where the knockback it deals would be proportional to a card's mass. So for example, it may knock back a golem 0.3 tiles since it's the heaviest troop in the game, but knock back a musketeer 0.8 tiles. The second is nerfing its crown tower damage to 10% of its original damage, making it less effective at spell cycling than Zap and Snowball, giving those spells a slight indirect buff. The most radical idea I think I have for this card is nerfing the range to 9.5 tiles, meaning it could no longer reach the Princess Tower from the bridge at all. This would change its function a bit by making it more of a defensive spell, making it more similar to the Barbarian Barrel. It would still be able to reach the King Tower when placed in the pocket though. I know this last idea would be a bit more devastating, but I think it may be what the card needs to put it in check. If it killed the card, I would buff it by giving it some of its knockback back, or buffing its damage a little bit to allow it to one-shot Firecracker. But I have one more idea to change the log that would nerf the log in a very unique way without nerfing any of its stats. I want to see this change implemented more than any change I've ever advocated for any card ever. I have been a pretty avid lumberjack player throughout my Clash Royale journey. I unlocked him back in 2016 and have been playing him ever since. He's easily my favorite card, but over the years with so many new non-legendary cards given such interesting mechanics, to me it's felt like lumberjack has been losing his legendary status. I think you know where I'm going with this. To nerf the log and make the lumberjack feel legendary again, I propose a change that would only affect the interaction between these two cards. If ever come face to face, the lumberjack will chop through the log, stopping it in its tracks. It just makes so much sense. What does a lumberjack do? Chop wood. He is a legendary too, so why couldn't he be given this incredible unique ability? Also, we would have counterplay to a spell, which is something that isn't possible and I think is a big problem that needs to be addressed. With the exception obviously being the monk, but I still think it can use some more. In the lumberjack's description, it literally says he chops trees by day and hunts the log by night. The lumberjack is the log's enemy and vice versa. He clearly has a rivalry against it. According to the lore, the lumberjack actually created the log by spilling a rage spell on a piece of wood accidentally. There's even an emote where the lumberjack is cowering in fear of the log. These two clearly have a very special relationship that I think needs to be fleshed out in the core gameplay. I have been wanting to see my lumberjack chop through a log for 7 years now, and I don't even think it would be overpowered. It's still 4 for 2, and the lumberjack wouldn't even be immune to logs. If the lumberjack was still deploying, frozen, or attacking another troop, the log would still hit him. They could even give the log a special attribute where it would deal double the damage to lumberjacks as a bonus since it would be harder to hit him with it. Maybe the lumberjack would even chase the log so you could actually pull the lumberjack with it. And just to be clear, this would not allow lumberjack to chop through the barbarian barrel. This is only for the log given their unique relationship. If there's one change I could ever make to Clash Royale, this would be it. But anyway, let me know what you think about my ideas and what card's history you want me to cover next. Thank you all for watching, and have a good one.